Our speaker to kick us off this morning is Daniel Strand of Arizona State University, who has become one of our most regular contributors to Providence and is a scholar of Augustine and a wonderful thinker and writer, and is working on producing for us, Providence, a pamphlet or a small booklet explaining the core purposes for which God ordained government, which I think that his talk this morning will touch upon. So we're looking forward to his talk and looking forward to that booklet, which I think has almost nothing like it that, to my knowledge, currently exists or is readily available in American Christianity. And so it's a much-needed resource. But Dan, we're delighted you could be with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Nowhere I'd rather be on a Saturday morning than listen to someone talk about God's vocation for government. So, glad you could join us for the second leg of the Bataan Death March. I will be your guide. Morning. Let's. What I'm going to do is offer a brief outline of a political theology. This is a contemporary word that, if you use it in the academy, it just means like a lot of different things, and I don't want to scare you with that word. But it is theology, a political theology in the true sense, which is a theology of how Christians ought to think about politics in a straightforward sense. So what I'm going to do is give you a basic outline of how I see so I'm not going to get into Romans 13 and what does Paul mean by this or that. I'm going to give you a sort of general map, and if the Q&A you want to ask questions, that's great. Let's get into that. But it is going to be a more theological discussion perhaps than we've had thus far. So forgive me, and I'm going to try to make it as digestible. I won't use immanentizing the eschaton or anything like that. But I may. I don't know. We'll see. Try to keep people awake or put them to sleep. Okay. So what I tend to see when I talk to groups of Christians, regardless of denomination or affiliation, is that people believe we more or less have the right sort of thinking about government, democracy, and political ideas, rights, natural rights, in place, and then we need to find a way to relate theology to that, right? So we know what good politics is, or at least we have a pretty good idea. Maybe we should tweak it here and there. But then how does theology fit into this? And I want to say that we have it precisely backwards if that's the way that we start thinking about it from a Christian perspective, okay? Theology must, if you're a Christian, meaning, obviously connected to the Bible, the works, let's say it this way, the works of God must be fundamentally determinative for the way that we think about politics, okay? Some prefatory remarks before I get into it. It's important, and I think for Americans especially, the comments yesterday about Americans' tendency to be anti-historical or, we've sort of left that stuff behind is a real problem, okay? And you see this when it comes out in politics as well. We tend to love reading people like John Locke and the founders, which I love the founders. There is a whole Christian theological tradition of reflection on politics that stems back to, at least as early as the 2nd century AD, okay? And as Americans, we, maybe we'll sort of cherry pick a little bit here and there, but we need to understand that, okay? So I'm trying to mediate this very long tradition, which is varied. It's not just a single tradition, but there is a lot of reflection that is going on for a millennia, 1,500 years before the American founding happens, okay? And I think that tradition also needs to inform the way that we think as American Christians about politics. Okay, let's get into it. So my first, I'm going to make one foundational theological claim, and then I'm going to talk about how the idea of our vocation, of actually being in government, is derived from that basic foundational claim. And then I'll close with a few words on the church and church in relation to government. So a proper understanding of government's vocation, as I said, must start from the works of God. What is that? So before we talk about human rule, was what's happening in politics, right? That's you're ruling over people. We must talk about divine rule. And you see this in the Bible and in the early church and beyond. The fundamental concept is the kingdom of God. The basic vision is this: God governs the universe, okay? God is the paradigm for governing. He's the ultimate paradigm. We tend to see, if you're an American, you see government as sort of a necessary evil because, government screws it up all the time, especially if you're conservative, right? Everything, just get government out of my life. But that is essentially what God does. God rules, okay? He governs all the universe. He governs creation. And thus government must be seen from within the entirety of the canon, the biblical narrative, as a means, or government must be seen as a means by which God rules. Not wholly, not completely. It's a pale reflection. It's not perfect. I think we grow allergic in saying that somehow God actually might be working through government, and especially if you live in a country where government is quite corrupt, that statement is probably even more outlandish. But nevertheless, it's true. God is up to something in history, and when we look at government, we see a locus of God's authority being mediated and exercised on earth. We cannot merely elaborate a set of, as some tend to do, we want to, elaborate a basic set of eternal, unchanging structures that we can find a sort of list in the Bible. I think that the speakers yesterday did a really good job of disabusing us that Christianity does not offer that. Unlike, say, Islam, or even, you see in the Old Testament, you get a very nice set of laws, 316, I believe, the rabbis counted. 613, yes, thank you. I had the numbers flipped, yeah. 613, give or take, one or two. But we do have, at least Christians have, this idea of God's reign, okay? That it's inaugurated in the creation of the world, brought to its fullness in the life, death, and resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ, right? God is, what is Jesus, what is the central message of Jesus preaching in the Gospels? It is the kingdom of God is here, okay? So this is all political language, and even though it becomes so familiar to us because you hear it maybe on Sunday or you hear it commonly given to you all the time, you miss those resonances that God is a king, that Jesus is a king, right? That should at least go, this might tell us something fundamentally about how our faith informs the way that we think about politics. So in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, God has fundamentally changed the course of human history, human existence. He has literally brought the dead to life. He will make all things new. Oliver O'Donovan, a theologian, political theologian, a very influential figure. I'd encourage all of you to read his work. Has a fantastic quote: "Theology must be political if it is to be evangelical." Let me say that again. And when he means evangelical, he doesn't mean the subgroup, right? He means the proclamation of the good news of Jesus Christ. Theology must be political if it is to be evangelical. He goes on, "Rule out the political questions, and you cut short the proclamation of God's saving power. You leave people enslaved where they ought to be set free from sin, their sin, and others." So, when you read the Epistle to the Romans, if we think, and when Christians have historically, and at least in contemporary discussions as well, want to know what government requires of us, we go to Romans 13, right? We must read 1 through 12, right? And 1 through 12 actually has a lot to teach us, strangely, maybe to our ears, about politics, or at least God's reign, okay, in this bigger sense. So that needs to frame how we think. God is ruling, so how does human rule relate to this? The gospel is public truth, not private truth, not mere, it is personal and it is individually salvific. Some people diminish that and say, oh, this personal salvation stuff is just kind of wishy-washy and uninteresting. No, that's absolutely essential, and we ought not lose that. But we ought not make it private, right? The gospel is, in a sense, public truth. This is a great, Leslie Newbegin makes this point over and over again. It is, in so much of the questions today in politics revolve around, you see it in, just recently it was in the hearing for a judge who was a Catholic, and Senator Dianne Feinstein made this comment that, you're going to bring your dogma into the law. Something around those lines. I think she had this really great line. The dogma lives loudly in you. Thank you. Yeah. But there is a very strong, and conservatives do this almost just as much as liberals, I find. We have this sense where we're not supposed to bring this private personal truth, because how can we expect people to believe this? But Jesus was crucified publicly, right? We're not given a special private message. God does his works before all to see. And I think that is profound in the sense that this truth is meant to shape everything that we do. The temptation is to expect too much from politics or too little, right? So the pacifists, which we heard of quite frequently yesterday, or idealists. The temptation is to make politics redemptive, and it ought not be. There's only one Redeemer. There's only one person who redeems, if you want to use that language. It is Jesus. So politics cannot do that. And if politics does that, it often becomes quite vicious and cruel. Because when human beings try to make politics do something it ought not do, and you see this over and over again, how people, what's the phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions? You see that often. So that's expecting too much, right? Luther was fond of saying, if the lion lies down with the lamb in this life, you will need to replace the lamb often. So God does not promise politics to be redemptive. But the twin tendency, or the twin extreme, is to say politics then is just amoral. It functions as a sort of necessity. It's the sphere of international politics is about clashing interests. We need to restrain evil, and it's just a sort of brute necessity. No. It can't be that either, okay? Morality needs to speak. Theology needs to speak to a certain extent. It needs to frame and shape the way that we think about politics and government in the practice of law and everything involved in the governmental sphere. And it cannot become detached from our thinking about God's rule. So government, I would like to argue, and this may sound very strange, and I know just even saying it kind of makes me cringe, but government must bear witness in this sense. In the way that Christians have talked for a long time, less, well, I don't know, I don't want to generalize too much, but that government in some vital way, I'm not talking about catechizing the populace and requiring that people, profess the Trinity, but that it does its work in light of God's saving works. Okay? It can't be agnostic about that point, at least if you're a Christian. Now we can talk about how exactly that's going to look and the temptations that come with framing it that way, and there are great temptations and potentials for great good and great evil, but nonetheless, it must be framed in that sense. All Christian government in this way must be secular, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. It doesn't mean the sense that we talk about it today, as being neutral about religion. It has to do with this time that we live in. The word saeculum, the Latin term, is used by early Christians to refer to this age. That's literally what it means. It's a historical reference. This life that we live before the return of Christ. And so you have to disabuse yourself of the way it's used often as a sort of stripping of all sort of really heavy claims about religion or moral claims when you enter the public realm. That's not what it was. It was an understanding, an awareness that we live in a time of waiting for the return of Christ. And that framed what governments ought to do. There are two rules in the Christian life. That's the term that eventually becomes the coin of the realm. And Pope Glacius was referred to yesterday by Thomas Farr. This becomes standard. Luther and Calvin both refer to these two rules, if you go back and read their work as well. So it's an ecumenical idea that there are two authorities, two rules. In Pope Glacius, when he enunciates it, the first really clear statement, he says that there's priestly authority and royal power. St. Augustine will say there's two cities, the city of God and the city of this earth. There'll be a very long debate about what the nature of these two rules are, and the Middle Ages spent a lot of time debating this point. It's fascinating, often has to do with popes. So as a Protestant crowd, it's actually really interesting. You should go back and read it. There's a lot of important things going on there, even if you don't think the Papa is, if you ascribe him that sort of authority. So there are two rules. There's one rule of God in these two rules underneath. You can say it's the church or spiritual rule and political rule. The most fundamental rule, of course, is God's rule. And political rule was viewed as a sort of, at least initially, as this, you kind of keep order in order to provide the largest scope for the rule of God in the life of human community. So that's how you get this. You can see how the rule of God actually narrows down and limits government. And I think is a good theological argument to be made from this position that you actually don't get limited government unless you have a very strong account of God's rule, right? Because how is government going to know it should be limited? Otherwise, there's some other authority limiting it, okay? I mean, we do in America usually by natural rights, or that government is limited in its action in terms of rights. So government is secular, as I had referred to. It means of this age. Dietrich Bonhoeffer uses the very helpful term, the penultimate, before the ultimate. Think of it in those terms. I think it helps. Secular government serves God's purposes in this age through punishing lawbreakers, providing the structures for an orderly society, passing laws that seek to redress wrongs. Shall not pass into the new heavens and the new earth. Right? Think about it in those terms. What's going to pass into eternity? Not government, not laws, right? Not our social structures. You will, hopefully, God willing, and me as well. So its role is remedial in this period of time that we live in this time of waiting. Secular government is a Christian creation. Christians created it. It wouldn't have been created, I think, otherwise. Most of our modern friends don't, or non-Christian friends don't want to acknowledge this. Some do, but it is a development of over a long period of time of enunciating the role of government as limited and temporal. Okay. So, I made this basic claim about the rule of God, the importance of the rule of God for human rule, that there's two rules. You have the rule, the spiritual authority and the political authority, and the political authority having its proper place within this framework. So what is the purpose of government? We've been talking in kind of larger terms here. How do we narrow it down to what is government supposed to do? Government's fundamental task, I want to argue or assert, is to judge between right and wrong in a public context and in an international context as well. Because governments make decisions not only about what's wrong or right within their own people, they also need to judge and make decisions about what they're going to do outside their borders. And you see this in the Bible often. God, if we want to think government is in some way analogous, takes on the function of God's judging in a limited sense, right? They're not deciding our salvation. We won't stand before government at the resurrection of the dead. But God has ordained government to serve this purpose, this secular purpose, to preserve temporal order, to preserve peace. God judges Israel. He judges the nations. In early Israel, the judges take up this role in the life of the Israelite community. Book of Judges, obviously, but the first, more often than not, God appoints these people to function this way in the community to judge. And so these people are a channel of common grace, as the term will eventually be described, especially in Protestant circles. That this is a grace provided for the common life of all people, regardless of their belief. It is a good that God provides. The sun rises and sets on the wicked. The same way God provides peace and order for people regardless. So we see judgment is an activity. It's an act. It's not primarily a structure or form of government. When we talk about the right form of government, or when we talk about the right government, we tend to talk about forms. Is it democracy? Historically, there's a long debate about the different sort of regimes that is the best way to govern a people. What government is an activity. What governments do is they judge, they act, and this requires power. So you have this act. Governments need to discern the right and the wrong. They need to punish. They need to preserve order, temporal peace. But then this requires power. You need to exercise power. There is no politics without power. And power is kind of a dirty word. I think a lot of people would like to banish the use of power from politics. Paul Ramsey famously says, the use of power, Paul Ramsey is another ethicist you should know, is a very, very influential Protestant ethicist writing in the 60s and 70s. He says the use of power and the use of force are the very essence of politics. By this I mean it belongs to politics' very act of being politics. Okay? So using power is essential. But power has an instrumental value, right? It's not an end in itself. It's used to preserve order, law, justice, other goods such as those. These are secular goods, temporal goods, goods of this age, but they are very real goods. Peace is a great good. Order, until it breaks down, you do not really appreciate how valuable order is. Does that make sense? You don't really appreciate. We walk around in society, and you don't notice exactly the ways that the common grace being exercised through government actually is profound in the most simple of activities, in the working of the law courts, in the long legal history in the West, due process rights and all of these things, the functioning of buses, providing travel, police officers doing their work, right? There's all these profound ways in which governmental power provides and sustains these very real goods for communities in society. So let me talk briefly about, more specifically here. Punishment, more often than not, if you read history of politics, is the activity first and foremost governments tended to do, which was the sort of bare minimum of providing security. So this punishment was is a protection of the common goods of society, of the traditions, the institutions, so that that society may be preserved. Judgment of government mediates God's judgment against injustice. And this is where we talk about war and national security. It's aimed at punishing the wrong, restoring peace and order. It does not advance the kingdom of God. Okay? Using force of arms has a divine purpose, and it serves an important divine sustaining of community, but it does not. Christians have always professed this. The kingdom of God is not advanced by force of arms, even as you understand it as a vocation that one can engage in, understanding it as a divine vocation. It is tragic. It causes destruction of life. But it does so for a purpose. It witnesses to God's opposition to injustice, right? It mediates God's righteousness. Calvin uses the term the vindication of the laws, right? The work of the magistrate in the work of warfare. It vindicates the laws. It preserves them. It protects them. It upholds the right. Unlike Islam, which commends the activity of warfare as an extension or part of expanding the faith, Christians have never, or at least most at times, they'll speak in this way, but I think we would all reject that, and the tradition rejects it as a whole. So national security and national interest in this context have an important role as mediators of God's common grace. Protecting and preserving our society and the nation-state system is an important part of government's vocation. National interest and national security, though, must be held to the bar of God's law, right? They are not an end in and of themselves, even though they do providing for the nation, securing the goods of the community, need to be understood as a possible vocation that God requires. Security at all cost and promotion of national interest at all costs is therefore needs to be rejected by Christians, right? They are great goods, they are important, but they are not ultimate. So we need to, there's a tendency to talk about national interest as though it's the only thing that matters. Augustine in City of God, Book 19, famously presents this image of the judge. And bishops at this time were actually, at the late Roman Empire, were very involved in, they actually judged cases. So Augustine himself would be sitting in and judging like a contemporary judge would. And he has this great illustration, and I think it's probably a personal one for him, in chapter 6 of Book 19, his most famous book in City of God, where he talks about the tensions of judging. And he brings out the ways in which human judging is fraught, right? And I think we know this. God commends it. It's absolutely necessary, and yet it's human judgment, meaning it is filled with error, ignorance. We don't know all the facts in a case, right? And Augustine, when he's presenting him this image of the judge, it's this judge who wants to do good for the community, but he is potentially punishing someone who is innocent. And he understands this tension. He must, and he comes to the conclusion, human community requires it, and at the same time, he presents himself before God and says, God, forgive me, right? He actually quotes the Psalm, I believe it's the Psalm, he says, deliver me from my necessities, right? You must sit in judgment, and yet you must ask for forgiveness, knowing that this judgment is going to be imperfect, potentially sinful. So you have this tension, and I think as Christians we ought not ever lose that sense of when you're acting in public life of it being absolutely good and required and mediating in a very vital way, mediating God's grace to seek to sustain order and peace, and yet it is a preliminary judgment sort of task that we undertake. They are fraught, and at the end of the day, when you're done serving, you need to go home, get on your knees, and ask God to forgive you. Lastly, let me say something about government and church. The church exists as a repository in memory of God's redeeming work and a sort of foretaste, looking forward to what God's going to do. The most important task for the church is not to go and be political. It's not to go and be the resistance or, to somehow find some way to go protest or whatever. The most important political thing the church can do is proclaim the gospel. To pray. To receive the sacraments. It reminds the government that their judgments are imperfect, at best, and that their laws and activities are not the final word for human life. The government punishes, engages with power in the use of force, rightly so, but this is not what God has planned for us in the new heavens and the new earth, right? It's a necessary activity that government performs, and yet the church bears witness to the final ends of human community, which are not what they are today. It brings an awareness to the fragility and finite nature of our own discernment in enacting justice and punishment. So the gospel creates space for life beyond government, for life beyond the political. It serves a vital function in communicating to us what the divine vocation of government is, its purpose, and enunciating the two rules, the rule of the spiritual and the political rule. It tells us that government has a vital, important function in judging, in using power to enact those judgments, right? And realizing that its judgments are not perfect, but they are needed and are an important way of mediating God's grace. So, open up the floor to questions, comments, denunciations.
I'm searching for the microphone as we speak. It's all very exciting. Dan, I'm going to let you pick people.
Okay.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. I'm Miranda. So my question is, I work a lot with grassroots and church involvement in politics. I'm on this ever-going quest to make sure that the church is engaged, and I get a lot of pushback from pastors all the time that it's not our place. And I go on these big long rants, but I would love to hear what are some points that we could use when engaging with Christians that don't feel like that they have any responsibility. I mean, I know that the church's first priority is the gospel, but I still want to shake every Christian that doesn't vote. Do you have any tips that we could use for when we try and grow that way?
Is it a more, I'd be curious as to what the pastor's reasons are for not engaging in political, or is it sort of a pietist thing that Christians aren't concerned with politics? Is that the...
I've heard several things. I've heard that our focus should only be on the gospel.
Yeah.
I've been told that if a pastor engages in politics, that he could lose members of his church, or that he could offend people,
Yeah.
or that his church would no longer be a safe place.
Yeah.
I've been told that our hope is not in the White House, it's in Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, I could give you a list. I could go on for hours.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the comeback, at least from a theological vantage point, is to say that to your evangelical pastors, all theology, if it's properly evangelical, must speak to politics. It doesn't mean you have to be a partisan. And I think the church ought not be partisans, and we must fight the resistance. Even if one party aligns with us strongly on a point, that's okay. But I think what we're seeing a reaction to, at least from my generation, which is not your generation, was living through periods of time like the moral majority, the Christian right, where evangelicals were wholly identified to the Republican Party. And many pastors who lived through that period now are very weary, especially evangelicals. They're trying to distance themselves. So I can understand that impulse. Nevertheless, I think you're right. They're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so you probably need to speak to that. You need to say, I understand you don't want to be a partisan, and that's good, and that's right. Nevertheless, the church can't prescind. They can't stand on the sideline and pretend like we just care about souls. Because if the kingdom of God, which is at the heart of the gospel, is good news for everything, it also means it speaks to politics. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And part of it is, pastors aren't total fools. They realize that you can't get up there and sort of rail them on political issues. So I am in sympathy on that front with them. But I think I track where you're coming from. Yep. Yeah. Questions? Yeah. Please.
Hello, my name is Ann Carmen. I'm from the King's College.
Okay.
And I was wondering if you would speak more to what you said about power and the features of power with government, because it seems to be that there requires some kind of mutual agreement of power. The people still have to acknowledge, because otherwise they can just like overthrow the government in a way.
Absolutely.
And we've seen that in many ways.
Yeah.
And you could even say that the people is where, or power lies with the people because of the way that they influence the government, even though they might have force. And so in that way, there's a power dynamic. But yeah, if you could just elaborate on the dynamics of power and why that's necessary for government.
Sure. So the idea, so this is where I think Christianity sits a bit awkward with contemporary democracy, especially American democracy. Our form of government seems to lay supreme stress on the consent of the people. I would like to say that government needs to realize it's under authority and that it's accountable to the people that it serves. So in that sense, I think that's right. But I do want to push back and say, ultimately, so government needs to be recognized by the people as legitimate and authoritative in that sense. But it derives its power from God first and foremost, right? We might say we have different mechanisms for authorizing government. And I think Americans tend to think that if the people just agree to it, then it's right. Or at least maybe that's a kind of extreme position, but I think it's a tendency. So power needs to be government needs to understand it's under an authority, right? It exercises power as an institution under authority. And I think this is very unfashionable to say, but we need to say, and I think all Christians need to say, that authority is God, right? And we can talk about different ways in which different governmental structures are going to hold government accountable. I think that's fair. It's not to say we just lift up the Bible to the president or Congress and say, listen. But I think it's important to stress that. A legitimate government needs to exercise power. They do. They need to use it. It's vital to the survival, to the flourishing of a community. Absolutely essential. If you don't have that, you don't have community. And I think many people would not like that to be the case, because power often means is demonized. It's kind of aligned with oppression, right? In our contemporary world, that using power is so we want to be. Jesus was nonviolent. He didn't exercise any power. He was. We stress the sufferings of Christ, which is appropriate, but also the kingdom of God comes in power. And Jesus exercises power in his ministry, and God does as well, right? So we need to see that as a sort of fundamental and important role, even if limited, right? So I think when we talk about the kingdom of God, it actually has a way of putting government in its place and helping it to realize it serves a vital purpose, but a narrow one, right? It exercises power not over human souls. It exercises power over these goods of society, preserving life, preserving order, but it's limited, right? So we need to keep that, find a way in proclaiming the gospel that it actually provides a way for us to keep that power at bay. And I think that's a really vital role that the church performs up front here. Over here.
Hello, Mr. Strand. Doug Burton. I'm with Burton News and Views, and I'm privileged to write for Providence. I was in Iraq for a couple of years, and I had to hear reports of terrible atrocities, and I still report on it. Now, my question is there a Christian consensus about anything when you talk about Providence? For example, in churches today, Christians are divided about gay marriage. They're divided about life. They're divided about religious liberty. I wonder, is there a Christian consensus about how Christendom ought to deal with the terrible persecution and atrocities that are being committed by Christians in Egypt and Iraq and Syria? Just, this is not an issue that we faced like 500 years ago. There really was a consensus about what all Christians believe. All Christians would agree then that it was evil to burn people in cages. I guess maybe most people today would agree, well, that's against the will of God. Yeah. But there is incredible division about and confusion about what is God's will. So in the current milieu, how do we determine a Christian consensus?
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. This side of eternity is not going to happen. As much as God gives us to see the right, we will see the right. But we are fallen, finite creatures, and as much as we want a sort of very clear and unambiguous representation of God's will on every issue, you have the creeds. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. So you do have consensus across denominations on some very vital things. When it comes to whether or not we should be going overseas to stop genocide, I think everybody would agree. I think you'd be very hard-pressed to find Christians that would disagree with that. What to do about it is a prudential consideration. And if we have limited resources, you have political will to deal with, you have all the complexities of marshaling armies, and then if every act of horror or genocide is our duty to respond to, then all of us better join up the army, and we'll spend most of our time traveling around the world trying to stop all these wars. So it's a very complex question. I'm not giving you a very satisfactory answer here, but important.
Thank you,
I
Dan.
think, yeah.